Anastasius I ruled the Byzantine world between 491 and 518. He's often overlooked, though, because his predecessor had already dealt with most of the major pressing issues facing the Byzantine world, such as the Ostrogothic problem in the Balkans. And he didn't embark on any grand schemes like Justinian and his megalomaniacal wars of reconquest. So people tend to look at Anastasius I as being a little bit boring, somewhat of a stopgap emperor who simply saved up enough money that one of his successors could go on to do something interesting. However, I will argue that that's not quite it. Anastasius I is interesting in his own right, both as a ruler and as a personality, and I'll argue that quite a few of the things that he did were actually impactful and shaped the future of Byzantium, beyond just storing up a stockpile of gold that Justinian went through like it was going out of style. So, without any further ado, let's look at Anastasius and his career. By the time that he ascended to the throne in 491, Anastasius was already about 61 years old, and he had already led an interesting life. He was born around the year 430 in the Adriatic city of Dyrrhachium, and he hailed from a noble family. It's not quite clear whether this family was noble in the eyes of the East as a whole, or whether it was more of a local nobility, but the chaos of the 5th century ensured that there were plenty of opportunities for people who had the necessary skills to advance. His immediate family were Arians. That is to say that they were members of the Arian heresy, and this sort of independent streak when it came to religious belief is something that Anastasius inherited, as we'll see. By the year 491, he held the office of Silentiaris. This was a high-ranking functionary of the Master of Offices, who was, of course, the head of the bureaucracy, and at this time also had some military functions that aren't super well-defined. And it's possible that Anastasius may have been one of the 4 Silentiari who were assigned to the Empress in person, and that would explain how he and Ariadne knew each other. At one point, there's also a story that Anastasius had been proposed for an empty bishop's see at Antioch, even though he actually was not a member of the church in terms of being a priest or something of that nature. When we think of the things that Anastasius is known for, presiding over peace, reforming the currency, saving up money, doing tax reform, we probably picture someone like Baxter Stockman from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, sort of a stereotypical accountant-looking dude. But that's completely wrong. Anastasius is the opposite. He's known for being tall, good-looking, and charismatic. Sometimes he was called Dicorus, which referred to the fact that he had 2 different eye colors. One of his eyes was blue and the other one was more black. And he retained his good looks well into old age. So he had that going for him. By the time he ascended the throne, he was known throughout the city, and by this point the city was still at least 500,000 people, probably more, as being someone who was pious and generous. And his sort of character traits are that he was inclined to be gentle, he was intelligent, he was energetic, which is always a good thing if you are the ruler of an empire, and he was cool-headed. He tended not to rush into decisions if he didn't have to. He held a lot of unorthodox religious views, however, and he was someone who would let his opinion be known in church. Supposedly, he would go into the Hagia Sophia, and he would sort of gather around people who wanted to listen to him, and he would expound upon his own views, even when they contradicted the Patriarch. Well, being that Anastasius is someone who is well known, the Patriarch saw all this, and actually banned him from attending church at the Hagia Sophia prior to Anastasius becoming emperor. In 491, the empire faced a potential succession crisis because Zeno had no clear heirs. He had died with no living children. So that meant that authority passed on to his wife Ariadne, who at any rate had always been his source of legitimacy since she had been the daughter of Leo the Thracian, and it had been Leo who had brought Zeno into the fold of political power in the first place. Well, after Zeno was dead, Ariadne met with the Senate, government ministers, and the Patriarch Euphemius in the Hippodrome, and there the assembled officials granted Ariadne the time to plan the funeral and gave her the freedom to select a new husband and emperor. Well, if we remember back, it looks like Anastasius was one of the Silentiari who worked directly for the Empress, so they would know each other. And based on what we know of Anastasius so far, we know that he was strikingly handsome, he had a lot of charisma, and he was someone who was in great health for his age, had a lot of skill in government, a lot of experience. So he was kind of a natural candidate, and it's really no surprise that Ariadne would pick him. And I guess you could even possibly speculate that maybe there had been a relationship between them prior to all of this. Certainly, there's that one story that Zeno was kind of murdered a little bit by his wife that we talked about in the last video. But at any rate, let's just assume Zeno died of natural causes, and then Ariadne just happened to work with this one guy named Anastasius, who happened to be, a relatively desirable mate, and that she chose him for that reason. One of the recurrent themes in Anastasius's life is that his religious eccentricity frequently got him into trouble. We saw that the Patriarch had previously banned him from attending the Hagia Sophia, and now Patriarch Euphemius, who is presumably the same Patriarch who banned him from the Hagia Sophia, opposes Anastasius coming to power at all because he just sees him as unworthy of imperial power. However, Ariadne and the Senate both see Anastasius as being a good choice, and they overrule Euphemius. But Euphemius still can hold certain cards and hold a little bit of leverage over Anastasius. So if you're Anastasius, what you really want is for Euphemius to participate in your coronation, and the only way to get Euphemius to agree is by signing a profession of orthodoxy. So Anastasius had to actually sign a piece of paper that said that his beliefs are entirely orthodox. And this will be something that will come back to bite him years later. However, on April 11th, the troops proclaimed Anastasius emperor, and on that day he swore a public oath to govern conscientiously and to not pursue any personal grudges. That also may have been something that Euphemius required. It's not really clear. It seems like Euphemius was the only person with any real objections to Anastasius coming to power, other than, as we'll see, the Isaurians. And when he came to power, in the long tradition of the empire, he offered a donative of 5 numismata to all urban citizens and a pound of silver to every soldier. And this donative, of course, is useful for getting people to like you, and also for making sure that the soldiers are loyal to you. On May 20th, about a month after he took office officially, he married Ariadne, and she became empress once again. The group of people most opposed to Anastasius' accession were the Isaurians. Zeno, of course, had been an Isaurian, and under his rule, many Isaurians had held prominent offices in Constantinople and throughout the empire. Zeno had a younger brother named Longinus, and he saw himself as the natural successor to Zeno, and the Isaurians in the capital saw it the same way. So a revolt broke out in 492, and this may have just been a glorified riot that gets the label of revolt. And this riot was more or less led by Longinus, but he was quickly apprehended, and Anastasius exiled him to Egypt after forcing him to enter the priesthood. It seems like he didn't take Longinus too seriously because there's no record of him having Longinus executed. In 492, though, the Isaurians rose up in a general uprising, and their generals were marching towards the capital. In response, Anastasius sent out the imperial generals John the Scythian and John the Hunchback, and the two of them were able to defeat the Isaurians in open battle. After that, by 494, the imperial generals were besieging the various strongholds of the Isaurians in the mountains, and over the next 3 years, from 494 to 497, the Byzantines will be conducting sieges. At the end of that period, they will have reduced all of the Isaurian strongholds, and after that point, we don't really hear very much more about the Isaurians being in positions of power in the Byzantine government, unless you count Leo the Isaurian, who probably wasn't actually of Isaurian origin. For Anastasius and his hold on power, the Isaurian War actually had a lot of benefits beyond the obvious benefit of putting down a potential rival in the form of Longinus and subduing a group of people who had exerted a little bit more authority over the state than most other people in that state had felt comfortable with. And those benefits are twofold. One, he gets two key supporters in the form of John the Scythian and John the Hunchback. He rewards both of them, and they will be key pillars of his administration from then on. In addition, Anastasius was able to lay a trap for his enemy and rival, the Patriarch Euphemius. So at one point during the revolt, Anastasius had gone to the Patriarch and confided that he was really tired of the war and that he was willing to make peace on less than ideal terms to get it over with. And the Patriarch had immediately leaked that to someone who then brought that information back to Anastasius. So now that he knew that the Patriarch was not someone who would keep his confidence, he had a pretext to get rid of him. So now Anastasius gets rid of the Patriarch, and he has removed a major potential thorn in his side, someone who never wanted him in power and was looking to undermine him in every step. So his actual hold and degree of control over the government is actually pretty well enhanced by this war, which you would think would probably weaken his hand and bring his legitimacy into question, since revolts are generally not seen as a sign that you are a good ruler. But in the case of Anastasius, he's able to take this revolt and make the best of it. While a considerable amount of his time must have been spent dealing with the disloyal Patriarch and the Isaurian Revolt, Anastasius also found the time to enact a sweeping reform of the Byzantine bureaucracy, and this reform really centered around making the economy and tax collection more monetarily centered. So from Diocletian on, the Roman and Byzantine world had often collected taxes more in kind than in monetary form. But Anastasius decided that it would be simpler and more effective to do it if everybody is just paying in the form of coin money. So this not only makes accounting much easier, but it also reduces corruption and embezzlement, since this is easier to trace and the records are more easily kept. In 498, he fully restored the range of coins that had existed prior to the chaos during the 5th century. So some types of coins that had been out of print for a while are now coming back, different denominations, that is to say. And that, of course, will aid Byzantine trade efforts as well as the collection of tribute. And I imagine it's also fairly useful for merchants and just common peasants at the market. But the thing that he did that probably earned him the most esteem in his own time, even if it didn't have the biggest impact going forward, was that he abolished the unpopular tax on receipts, which is something that people had to pay when they paid their taxes. And from what I understand, and I could be a little off on this, it is sort of a tax you have to pay in order to say that you paid your taxes. So it's a little redundant to begin with. So anyway, he gets rid of that, and that had been sort of a regressive tax that had hurt the poor more than it had hurt everybody else. And that was something that earned him quite a bit of love from the common people. Although, as we'll see, he was able to diminish that love through other actions. But at least economically, the common people kind of liked him. From 440 all the way until Anastasius' reign, there hadn't really been any major issues between Byzantium and Persia. But then that changed because of the chaos that Kavad I inherited from his father Peroz. So Peroz had led an ill-fated expedition against the Ephthalites, who are also known as the White Huns, and that had left Persia really endangered. So Kavad had been struggling for his entire adult life to really get Sasanian Persia back on a level footing. So he had been briefly deposed from 496 to 498. He had come back, and he was really struggling financially to meet the cost of paying off the tribute that he had to pay the Ephthalites to keep them from raiding his territories. Or, he could also use that money potentially to build up an army and deal with them that way. But at either rate, he didn't have enough money to do either of those things. Now, previously, the Byzantines had a policy where they would pay tribute to Persia, and in exchange for that tribute, the Persians would leave them alone, and the Persians would use that money to offset the cost of their own northern frontier defenses against the Ephthalites. However, that arrangement had ended under Zeno, because a previous treaty had stated that the Persians would relinquish control of Nisibis to the Romans after 120 years. That term came up under Zeno, and then the Persians had said that there's no way they're giving up Nisibis. So Zeno said, well, in that case, you're not getting any more money from us. So Kavad told Anastasius that the Romans needed to get back to paying the tribute the way that they should, and Anastasius ended up continuing Zeno's policy of saying that they're not going to pay without Nisibis. And also, he and his advisors concluded that it was best if the Ephthalites kept the Persians occupied and weakened. That way, there's no way that Kavad could get any designs on Roman territory. So, Anastasius refused his demand and thought that nothing would come of it. He didn't think Kavad could really do anything about it. Anastasius had made a rational calculation, but there's one thing that he ignored, and that is that if you're Kavad and your number one priority is getting money before you go broke, the quickest and easiest way to get that money is through war. And the only rich neighbor that Persia had, with cities that were in striking distance, was the Byzantine Empire. So in 502, Kavad's forces launched a surprise attack. They managed to capture Theodosiopolis in Armenia, and they also besieged and captured Amida, although that was a much longer and harder fight. This, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was the first major war between the two empires since 440. Now, Anastasius at this point was willing to make peace by offering money and getting his cities back, but Kavad rejected that offer. The reason we'll see is because in order to wage a protracted war against the Persians, Anastasius would have to strip down his defenses elsewhere. Now, eventually, he does do just that, and he sends out a large force, which ultimately will fall under the supreme command of Keller, who is the Master of Offices, and they will ultimately start to overwhelm the Persians starting in 504, when their forces are larger than the Persians and a lot better organized. A treaty will be signed in 506, the frontiers will be restored to what they were, and it looks like Anastasius agreed to pay some money to the Persians to keep them silent. It's not entirely clear whether he paid this money to Kavad to make him shut up about the new city that he built on the frontier against Persia, or whether this was part of the general peace agreement. But at any rate, let's talk about the city that Anastasius built in order to prevent another overrun of some of his eastern provinces. Although the official dates of the Anastasian War are 502 to 506, 505 and 506 were not very eventful years. There weren't really any major battles, and it was mostly just a time of negotiation. So from 505 on, Anastasius was doing two things. One was sending relief to the citizens in that area, rewarding the Amadines and others for their bravery, and also making sure that the frontier was better fortified going forward. So he upgraded the fortifications at Edessa, Batnai, and Amida, which were, some of the major centers that the Romans relied on to hold their frontier. But the biggest move that he made was fortifying a place called Dara, also known as Daras, which was just west of Nisibis. And the reason for him doing this is that originally the city of Nisibis had been in Roman control, before Julian's defeat in 363, that is. And Nisibis was at a perfect location for allowing easy entry into either Roman Syria, so as sort of a gateway into Roman Syria, or a gateway into Persian Mesopotamia. So it was this key position that allowed one side to really have the initiative against the other. And that's why the Persians were not willing to give it up when the 120-year agreement came due in 483. So, to make up for that, and to prevent himself from having to carry this war on for several more years and capture the city of Nisibis, Anastasius resorted to building Dara just west of Nisibis. That way it'd be located in the same area, and it would cancel out the advantage that the Persians had by controlling Nisibis. Now, obviously, Kavad objected to that because that took away the strategic advantage that he held over the Byzantines, but Anastasius, of course, persisted anyway. He had the stronger army, and, he probably paid some of that money to the Persians just so they would accept the presence of Dara on their frontier without trying to prolong a war that they couldn't actually win in the first place. So when Anastasius had amassed these large armies in the east, he had done so by removing units from the Balkans. And one of the consequences of that is that without the Balkan armies at full strength, the Balkans were easy prey for raiders from the other side of the Danube. So to make up for that and to prevent future raids from getting so close to Constantinople, Anastasius constructed what became known as the Anastasian Wall, which was a fortification network about 40 miles west of Constantinople, which was designed to seal off the city from any invaders getting anywhere close. And this fortification would last until the 7th century, when the Arab invasions would make the empire simply too poor and too undermanned to bother with holding such a fortification. And we also know that even before that, raiders were able to get around this wall more than once. So it might not have been his greatest legacy, but it is a definite throwback to the Roman fortifications of earlier eras, especially the Wall of Hadrian in Britain. So earlier I mentioned that one of the recurrent themes in Anastasius' life is that his religious eccentricity tended to get the better of him. And that was on full display in 512. So somewhere before or during the course of the year 512, Anastasius had become a convinced Miaphysite. And this was at odds with the established orthodoxy, and certainly was not covered by the oath that he had made to the Patriarch Euphemius about his orthodox beliefs. So in 512, it looks like Anastasius decided to test the waters, and he deposed the sitting Patriarch of Chalcedon and put a Miaphysite in his place. And that really alienated the current Patriarch of Constantinople and caused a riot in Chalcedon. In addition, many people in the capital were also upset, and this really put Anastasius in the hot seat. And it's worth pointing out that up to this point he had been very popular and very successful, and he had just created a problem for himself out of thin air. This is something that did not have to happen. It was not foisted upon him, and the rest of his reign will be largely colored by this decision, and it will really reduce the overall legacy that he'll be able to leave. One thing about the Byzantines that's often hard for modern observers to really comprehend and wrap their heads around is just how important the details of religious belief were to Byzantine citizens and officials. So up to 512, Anastasius had maintained Zeno's Henoticon, and that had been satisfactory enough. It hadn't really led to any problems. But then when he had tried to put a Miaphysite Patriarch in power at Chalcedon, that had really precipitated an entire crisis. And now, in the face of mounting criticism and rumors of conspiracy, Anastasius appears bareheaded before the crowd at the Hippodrome, and then he offered to either voluntarily step down to allow a better ruler to take his place, or to renew his promise to enact good government. By appearing bareheaded, what he was doing is showing his humility. He wasn't wearing his crown or advertising his rank. He was coming to them as a suppliant. And ultimately, it appears that Anastasius' old charisma was still very much intact. And the crowd was easily won over, and they went from demanding his resignation to urging him to remain in power and govern well. And you would think that would be the end of it, except that someone had already decided to use this opportunity to launch a revolt, and that person was named Vitalian. Anastasius had dealt deftly with the danger of the crowd in Constantinople. However, other dangers lurked just outside of the city walls. So there was a broader discontent with Anastasius, some of which was not actually his fault. When he had made his financial reforms and his moves to fight corruption, this had not necessarily been popular with the elite. many people in the elite had benefited from the corruption in the system. And they also had possibly been forced to pay more taxes due to the increase in the efficiency of tax collection, even if the tax rate had not been raised by Anastasius. So there were some people who were willing, able, and ambitious when it came to opposing Anastasius with arms. Not to mention that Anastasius was old, and his only potential heirs were his nephews, and none of them were all that impressive. So, he didn't really pose all that much of a threat to a usurper, the same way that a younger ruler would, or someone who had more vigorous heirs. It's also possible that the army of Thrace was discontent with Anastasius because he wasn't a military man, and they would prefer someone who was more beholden to them. That was a pretty common theme in earlier Roman history. There's no reason to think that anything substantial had changed since then when it came to the ambitions of soldiers putting their own generals on the throne. So there were potential sources of discontent, and they all began to gather around the person of Vitalian. Now, Vitalian had first risen to prominence in 503 during the Anastasian War, and now in 513 he had risen to the rank of Count in Thrace, and in that capacity had risen up against the master of soldiers in Thrace, who was none other than Anastasius' nephew Hypatius. And after defeating Hypatius, killing some of the other officers, Vitalian had then been able to get many troops to defect to his side. Maybe he was playing up the religious angle, fighting for orthodoxy, or maybe he was doing something else and pointing out that Anastasius and his family were not militarily capable. It's really hard to say exactly what the nature of Vitalian's appeal was, since Vitalian didn't really live to tell the story about, what drove his success. Vitalian also apparently recruited Thracian peasants, and he managed to have a large force camped outside of Constantinople in late 513. Although he had had his dramatic reconciliation with the populace of Constantinople not all that long before, Anastasius was still worried that the people there might change their minds, and he also thought that it would be possible to convey whatever understanding they had of him to the troops outside the walls. So he erected bronze crosses with his version of events on the walls of Constantinople, both to reassure his own public that they were on the right side, and to possibly try to win over some of Vitalian's adherents. So, in order to prevent the revolt from spreading even further, Anastasius quickly moved to lower taxes on the provinces to his immediate east, that, seemed to have been effective since the revolt did not spread into the Asian provinces. And negotiations then began between Anastasius and Vitalian's representatives. So Vitalian himself would not go meet with Anastasius, since he probably correctly assumed that Anastasius would have him seized and executed had he been foolish enough to agree to an in-person meeting. But Anastasius did meet with Vitalian's officers, and in the resulting negotiations, they agreed to refer the religious dispute to the Pope's arbitration and to meet all of the Thracian army's demands. And it looks like what happened is Anastasius turned on the charm yet again. He offered gifts and promises, and Vitalian's officers were totally won over. So when they got back to camp, Vitalian was not satisfied with the agreement, but his officers said that they were. And without their support, obviously Vitalian couldn't really do all that much, so he agreed. And peace was made for the moment. Vitalian then went back to Thrace, and it looked like things were settled for the time being, but Anastasius was simply biding his time. So Anastasius was determined to get rid of Vitalian before he became an even bigger problem. So in the autumn of 513, he appointed Cyril to be the new master of soldiers in Thrace, and sent him with an army and orders to eliminate Vitalian and then take over the position that Vitalian had assumed by virtue of his revolt earlier. So the two forces had a few skirmishes, but nothing came of it, and what ultimately happens is that Vitalian will then bribe some of Cyril's men to admit him to the city of Odysseus, where Cyril had his headquarters, and Cyril will then be assassinated, and his army will be defeated. At that point, since Vitalian has killed a master of soldiers, Anastasius officially has him declared a public enemy. Presumably he went to the Senate in Constantinople to get that declaration made. And then he sent out a much larger force under his nephew Hypatius and a general named Alathar, and they were on the trail of Vitalian from late 513 on. Now, early in this campaign, the Imperial forces managed to win a minor victory, but then Vitalian launched a surprise night attack at Acris, and that resulted in the defeat of the 80,000-man Imperial army and the capture of both generals as potential ransom, something that Vitalian was to take full advantage of. The Battle of Acris in late 513 and the subsequent descent of Vitalian and his victorious army on Constantinople absolutely has to be the perigee of Anastasius' reign. So, right after the battle, Anastasius had dispatched 1,100 pounds of gold to try to ransom Hypatius, and if the sources are to be believed, what happened is that Vitalian ended up finding that gold and then pretending that it had been lost, and he kept it because he didn't want to ransom Hypatius for that little. There was supposedly a personal grudge between them. It looks like maybe when Hypatius was the master of soldiers in Thrace and Vitalian was a count, that Hypatius may have made moves on Vitalian's wife. At any rate, there was definitely a grudge there, it seems. And later in 514, Vitalian then led his whole army and a fleet that he had gotten out of the Black Sea to Constantinople. And at that point, Anastasius has no choice but to renew negotiations with Vitalian. During those negotiations, he agrees to pay 5,000 more pounds of gold. It's not clear whether that was for part of the general agreement or just to get Hypatius back. But we do know that Hypatius was released at this time. He appointed Vitalian as the master of soldiers in Thrace, so he gave Vitalian sort of a secured office. This is similar to the kinds of agreements that emperors were making in the 5th century when they would give people like Theodoric Strabo such an office in order to, establish a permanent relationship and give that person a permanent hold on power. And Anastasius agreed to undo all of his Miaphysite changes. He had made some change to a church service, I forget exactly the details, and also to remove the Miaphysite bishop of Chalcedon and replace him with his more orthodox predecessor. They also agreed to hold a council under the Pope's direction the next summer at Constantinople. So this is the result. All of this is the result of Vitalian's massive victory at the Battle of Acris. And again, this is another part of the extended perigee of Anastasius' reign from 513 to 514. So it looks like there was a kind of uneasy peace for about a year, and as it became increasingly clear that Anastasius had no intention of making good his word about convening a church council, Vitalian decided to come back to Constantinople in force in 515. Now, when he first arrived, it looks like the imperial side was pretty thoroughly demoralized. Two of Anastasius' senior commanders refused to fight Vitalian on the grounds that they were his friends, but it's also just as likely that because so many commanders had taken a beating at Vitalian's hands, they just didn't want to get humiliated or be responsible for the loss of the capital to Vitalian. Maybe also they just thought Vitalian would win and they didn't want to be, considered rebels against the future emperor. At any rate, Anastasius was able to find someone to take supreme command, and the person he found was someone named Marinus, who was one of his friends, and someone who was a former Praetorian prefect in the east. Marinus, so far as we know, doesn't really have much military experience before this date, but yet he was able to defeat the ace general Vitalian. So, Marinus did this by leading his fleet out to fight Vitalian's fleet, and he had a trick up his sleeve. A few years before, a Greek philosopher in Athens had developed something which was kind of a precursor to the later Greek fire that we'll see in the 7th century. And it looks like this came as a complete surprise to Vitalian's fleet. It spread through that fleet like wildfire, and after the loss of this fleet, Vitalian was demoralized, and so was his army, and they fled the scene, thus leaving Anastasius completely victorious and once again in full command of the empire. I suppose it's fair to characterize the last 3 years of Anastasius' reign following his final triumph over his own folly as his Twilight Years. So, the council that Anastasius and Vitalian had negotiated under the Pope's supervision never ended up materializing, and that really hurt relations between the two churches, because if you know anything about the medieval Pope, it's that he takes literally any opportunity that he gets to extend his own power and field of competence. So when word got to the West that the Pope was supposed to do this big negotiation between factions in the East, you know that he was excited, and then Anastasius had no intention of cooperating, and that must have been deeply annoying to the Pope, who was on the verge of really extending the papal authority. As for Vitalian himself, he went into hiding after 515. There's one tradition that he was once again in open revolt by 518 at the same time that Anastasius died, but who knows? If anything, it would have been a small revolt, so who cares? But we do know that over the course of this 3-year period, many of the chief adherents of Vitalian were rounded up and killed. Vitalian ended up being restored to favor under Justin I. I guess it would be better to have a rebel on hand than somewhere else. And he actually oversaw some negotiations between Justin's government and the papacy. But then he was executed in 520 for reasons that aren't entirely clear. I guess, once somebody has launched a rebellion, you can never fully trust them, and there's always going to be some suspicion. At any rate, back to Anastasius. So late in his life, he decided to hold a banquet to try to figure out which of his 3 adult male nephews would end up succeeding him. So he had 3 reclining couches put in his dining room, and under one of the pillows he had the word Imperium, or some other word that would indicate that one of them would succeed to the throne. Well, 2 of his nephews ended up sharing a couch, and the implication in the source is that the 2 of them were not only incestuous, but homosexual. So the couch with the magic slip of paper ended up going unoccupied, and that's how Anastasius knew that his own family would not inherit the throne. So he went and did a little more praying, and it was revealed to him that the next person who came into his quarters would be the next emperor. So he's probably expecting to see his personal attendant, who would be a really unlikely candidate for the throne. But that morning, the first person to come in was the head of his bodyguard corps, Justin. And that's when Anastasius knew that the next emperor would be Justin I. Or at least that's how the story goes. It strikes me as rather unlikely, but it's an interesting story, so I shared it with you. So what is the legacy of Anastasius? Well, his currency reforms were long-lasting, and if you think of something quite as essential as how people conduct their daily business and how the government operates in terms of how it collects revenue, that's a very big legacy to have, something which would have an outsized impact on the future. The Anastasian War prefigures later wars between Byzantium and Sasanian Persia. And speaking of that, actually we'll do an entire podcast episode on the Anastasian War on behalf of the new podcast Forgotten Battles. I am going to be the author of a piece on the Anastasian War. Look out for that later in the spring or early in the summer. I'll provide a link in due time once that materializes more fully. Anastasius also built Dara's castle in his native Dyrrachium, and that was constructed during his reign, or at least greatly enhanced at that time. You can see this today in modern Albania. Anastasius also holds the distinction of being the last emperor to be deified after his death. This is a tradition that goes all the way back to Augustus. Actually, his uncle Julius Caesar was also given that treatment, but it was something that had been an imperial tradition for a long time, and Anastasius is the last person to receive deification, even though by this point we were nearly 200 years into the Christian era, and Anastasius himself was very clearly Christian. One of the major things that Anastasius did, which will really give Justinian and future rulers a lot of strength and resilience, is that he left behind an efficient bureaucracy and a full treasury. As for the family of Anastasius and their impact on history going forward, his incompetent nephew Hypatius survives and goes on to live until the year 532 in peace. He probably by that point realized that he was completely unsuited for government or military work, and he was living peacefully, minding his own business. And then there was the Nika riot in 532, and they decided to try to elevate Hypatius to emperor against his will. So Justinian probably knew Hypatius and understood that he's about as innocent and non-threatening as any relative of a former emperor could possibly be, but supposedly Theodora saw Hypatius as enough of a threat that she demanded that he be executed so that the crowd would have no one else to turn to as a potential rival for Justinian. So that is the legacy of Anastasius, and I hope that I've proven that Anastasius and his reign are interesting in their own right, and that he is someone who deserves more study and attention.